Hey, I'm Carl Moore. Welcome to Meaningful Capitalism. Really excited to be here today to share with you some of the resources that we've used along the way.
And I'm Brant Greathouse, and today we've got 3 books each that we want to share with you. I think have got some good nuggets.
All right, so you're going to start at number 1, you're going to start at number 3.
I think we ought to start at number 3.
Okay, go for
Work
it.
our way up.
What's your number 3 book?
So for me, I thought, I've read hundreds of books. I don't know how many, and I also don't know how many other book lists that people have done in different podcasts sharing this type of a thing. But I thought, do I want to pick some that nobody else would pick, or do I want to pick some that, everybody's familiar with? And I went with some things that were kind of nostalgic to me, some things that were early on transformational that I really pulled away, specific things that I can pinpoint how it's impacted my journey over the last number of years. And so that's what you're going to see with my 3. The first one that I would say, which is my number 3, is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
And why is that?
There's each of the 7 habits are going to be particularly valuable in different things, but I'm going to tell you about habit number 3. Habit number 3 is begin with the end in mind. And what that requires is for somebody to be present future thinking in the way that they think. Not always dwelling on the past, not always dwelling only right in the present, not only dwelling in the future, but being present future thinking. And what I love about the exercise that the book draws out of that is that it doesn't just say, hey, think about your goal and then work your way backwards. It says, think about the end of your life.
That's different.
It's very different, because when you think about, the end of your life, what do you want people to be talking about when they think about you at the end of your life?
So have you done that exercise where you write your own eulogy?
Absolutely.
So I got to do that a few weeks ago, and it was very empowering, actually.
Oh, it's incredible, and I would recommend to everybody that they ought to take some time. That's one of those types of things that is, kind of would get put on the back burner. You have to make time to do this. But if you're going to take that habit number 3 seriously and begin with the end in mind, so that everything in your life is pointing towards that trajectory, it takes some thinking time. It takes some diligence, writing it down, journaling it, processing it, and or whiteboarding it out, whatever your process is. But what's powerful is it actually has a mechanism that allows everything that you're doing to sort of be heading in that same trajectory. And that in itself, all that momentum and all that energy has the ability to push you towards greatness in what you're doing, because it's unified towards one purpose.
Yeah.
Well, what about you?
So my book number 3, and I know we're talking about business books, but if you look at people over time, if you look all the way back to the beginning of humanity, we've passed on stories, because stories infiltrate our soul in a way that, I can't tell you how many facts I learned in high school that don't stick with me, but teachers and stories and places that we were at when things happened just resonate with us. And so for me, book number 3 is a book called Endurance. And actually they just found that ship at the bottom of the ocean. And so if you haven't read that book, you should absolutely read it or listen to it. It's on Audible. But these guys set out on one journey, and their journey was interrupted by a series of events, and it became not necessarily about accomplishing what they originally set out to, but overcoming the odds and just pushing through where most people, I believe, would have given up and just gone down with the ship. These guys did something that, for me, just directly relates to business. You're on your way and something sideswipes you. The winds come from the wrong direction. You anticipate and look out, and there are just things that happen in life that you just can't predict. And so it's been just so powerful to me to say, hey, just persevere, keep going, wake up every day. Mercies are new every morning. You can do something today that you didn't get to do yesterday. And whatever happened yesterday does not affect your reality today. Keep going. And
I love that.
And that is exactly what I've gained from that book. And on hard days, I'm like, well, my life wasn't as hard as those guys' days. So I got to get out of bed and it's time to make something happen.
Come on now. That's good. That's good. I like that one.
Okay, so give me your book number 2.
All right, so for me, number 2, I'm going to say is... And I had a really hard time kind of thinking of this one, but the lesson that comes from book number 2 is really what I was going after. There's a book by Grant Cardone called 10X. And 10X was particularly valuable to me because it taught me how to think bigger than what I normally would and go after something greater than what I would normally consider reasonable. And since reading that book, I've just internalized a belief system that we ought to pursue things that are bigger than what other people think is reasonable, because who are they to say what's reasonable or not? Nobody in history who's done anything great started off just doing something with no great vision. They all had something that was such a powerful and motivating vision that pushed them beyond all unimaginable hurdles. And 10X, the premise of it is, I would boil it down to 2 key insights. It's 10X, the things on the financial side of what you're trying to accomplish, and 10X, the results that are capable, that are possible from what you're trying to accomplish. So,
okay, give me one example here. What was a thought that you thought was big that you 10x'd, and then when you went for the 10x, where did you actually land on that scale?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, I thought to myself, you know what I'd really like to do is I'd like to buy enough rent houses to where the cash flow, the profits from those rent houses was paying for my mortgage and basic cost of living. And back then I calculated that it would take about 10 properties, 10 houses, to be able to reach that number for myself. And, if you're applying the 10X rule, then I need to take, instead of thinking about 10 houses, it actually needs to be 100 houses.
So you aim to get 100 houses as your rental income instead of just 10.
Yeah, and I was like, man, if 10 would be life-changing, what would 100 houses be doing for me? And, I thought, man, it's going to take me forever to get 100 properties. And but I set out nonetheless, and I actually ended up doing twice 100.
Wow.
More than 200 properties over a period of time, over a period of just, less than, about 6-7 years. I was able to do that, but I never would have thought in the beginning that was reasonable to go after if I hadn't been thinking bigger.
Right, because if you're just going for 10 houses and you think, well, I got to get that done in a year, you're thinking that's one house a month that I have to conquer, be able to create the way to keep it as cash flow. But in volume thinking, even though I know you flipped some of those houses and you didn't keep them all for cash flow, you ended up creating a process that lets you just blow past what you thought was possible.
Exactly.
That's incredible.
Well, a quote that Tony Robbins always says is that we often overestimate what we're capable of doing in a year, and we way underestimate what's capable in a decade.
That's great.
That's good.
That's great.
What about you?
Okay, so
Number 2.
My book number 2, and I want to make this disclaimer because this book is also on your list. We set out and wrote these lists of these books separate and came to this podcast, and so we had the opportunity to go, That one's on both of our lists. So this is that one. It's The Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yes.
Man, I grew up on the poor side of town. My parents, barely got by. They both had to work jobs. I never missed a meal, but at the same time, we didn't grow up at the country club. That was not something I ever experienced in life. And so after I got married, it might have been you or one of our other friends in that friend group handed me this book and said, hey, go read this. And I'm like, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, what are we even talking about here? And reading those concepts opened my eyes in a way to see the world and to see money differently. I took those principles home and I sat down with my wife and I was like, hey, look at this, read this. We're gonna have to start changing this and stop thinking about that. And we gotta change everything.
Yeah.
And it radically changed the foundation. I actually had to do away with the foundation that I grew up on top of and rebuild something new to be able to step into and do kind of like what you're talking about with the 10X. With my old mentality, I was always going to just go out and get a job. I was going to work for somebody else, and I was going to build somebody else's kingdom. And in what that book gave me was the power to say, hey, my future is in my hands. I can go forth and I can do whatever I want to. I have that power.
That's
and
good.
It was life-changing for us.
It is a game changer, and isn't it cool? So I actually put it as number one because it was one of the very first books that was transformational and left me with just some gold that I've applied to every aspect of my life, financially and in business. My dad actually gave me that book, and he said, hey, you need to read this book. I was in high school. I hated reading, which I didn't realize at that time how valuable it is to spend time reading multiple books a year, or multiple books a month. And now I read all the time, but at that time I didn't read it. He gave it to me in high school, and it wasn't until I was in college and I was forced to read a lot, and I was like, I want to read something for pleasure, and I picked up that book that he had given me and I read it, and I couldn't put it down, and I ended up reading it 7 more times within the same year, because every time I read it, it was like light bulbs were going off all the time. So many lessons. I would give you guys a couple of them. One of the big ones is that he talks about in the book, how to not work for money, but to make money work for you. What do we spend most of our lives doing is trading our time, our most valuable asset. We're trading our time for money. And he says, no, don't trade time for money. Spend your money to make more money. And that's the concept of investing, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a day job. You always want to be investing in assets so that those assets are going to be producing additional income in addition to your paycheck. He says, always mind your own business. So you might be working in a day job, but you always want to have something going on the side that's producing additional revenues. And for me, early on I had a day job, but I was always looking for ways to acquire assets. And he talks about the difference between assets and liabilities, and he talks about all these different things. And a liability is something that takes money out of your pocket. An asset is something that puts money into your pocket. And I started buying assets, and eventually those assets got to the point where they replaced my income from my job, from my work. And I was like, man, now I have my job income and I have this other income. I was making twice as much.
Which is great,
and kept
right?
going from there, absolutely.
Yeah. And
so that was my number one because it was early on for me.
Oh yeah, that's so powerful. And my number one is a very similar number one. One last thing for this. If you don't want to have a side hustle, but your day job is making you enough money that you have cash, then you need to find a company similar to ours that invests capital for you for these returns. And now you can have the pleasure of all of the time that you want.
Yes.
And you can work your day job if you want to. You don't have to give that up.
Your money can buy time for you.
Yeah. So this is a book that it's my number one. This is a book that I have spent so much time reading, and it's the book that I've recommended to more people than any other book. And while it does not have anything to do with business, it has everything to do with business. This is a book that should be taught in classrooms around the country. It's something you should share with your children. It's something that you should connect with on a personal level, because it will transform your life. And I really wish there was a better name for this book, because it sounds a little bit manipulative, if I'm honest. In fact, I've had this book for like 4 years before I finally read it, and it's How to Win Friends and Influence People. This book has transformed my life. It is essentially, I think it has a lot of biblical principles, how to treat other people the way you want to be treated. The Bible says how to treat other people how you want to be treated. This is like the how-to of that. And it works in every aspect of life. So I first read it when I got into cold calling sales, and it was like, I got to be able to burst through this door and get people to like me. This seems like it makes sense to read in this context. Well, then I read it again in perspective to my wife, in perspective to children, in perspective to starting a business, in perspective to employees. And every time I read it, I have so many things that I do that are so selfish. And when I can get out of my own selfish way and care about other people, everything I do flourishes.
Don't we tend to think about ourselves quite a bit?
Oh, yeah.
Much? Everybody.
That's all I think about. I think, is my voice sound weird?
Yeah.
And, anybody listening to this, like, no, you're just Carl, and that's fine. But I'm like, did I say that weird?
Yeah.
Because we all think of ourselves all the time. So how do we get out of that?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my bonus. Are you all ready? Little drum roll.
Get it.
All right. So this one is not a book. My wife was like, hey, you want to go watch a movie? And I said, sure. And she said, it's at the drive-in. So I go to the drive-in. We put the top up on the back of the 4Runner, and we had made a little cot. Our dogs are in there with us. We had a babysitter, so we didn't have our kids with us. And she shows me The Greatest Showman, which was a musical. And I was like, what did you get me into? And this goes back to my first book. The story is what brings it alive. And I remember at the end of that movie, I didn't sleep for 4 hours that night as I journaled about my own story and the things that happened. And I remember I came to you, and it was when our business was young. We didn't have any employees. And I said, what we need to do to accomplish something this afternoon is I need to take you to see a movie that's transformational. And I remember you and I were the only two inside of this movie theater watching The Greatest Showman, a musical. Surely everybody thought that there was something going on between us, but there was a big business. But ultimately, a great story that drove us into something great.
Absolutely, and any of those stories where it pushes, where you're pushing beyond what's possible and having to overcome massive obstacles. And that movie is such a beautiful, beautifully done, and it shows just how somebody can rise above their circumstances. We are not a product of our circumstances. We have authority and are able to rise above our circumstances. And so,
that's one thing I do love about being here in America. We are not bound by the place that we are born or the color of our skin or our gender or our religion. We can do anything we want to. And
that's right.
I
believe that.
I just love the fact that we can do that. And most things in business, only 20% of it's knowledge. If you notice, most of my books are about the 80%, which is get out there and keep going.
Yes.
Don't get held up. Don't get driven into the ground and get stopped. Do something inspiring.
Let's go do something inspiring.
I'm Carl Moore. This is Meaningful Capitalism. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.